Welcome to the last talk here on second day morning UGM 2021. This is John Constable from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. His title this year is Herons, Yaks, and Technical Debt. This is IRODs at the Sanger Institute over the last year. All right, John, you're up.
Thank you, Tal. Okay, so hello, everybody. Not a call for help. I do know who I am, but perhaps some of you don't. I'm John Constable. I work in the informatics support group at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. This means I'm part of the team that looks after IRODs at Sanger, and I've worked with IRODs since about 2014. We've got a large installation, probably not the biggest, but maybe the most complex infrastructure-wise. I'm not sure. This isn't a mine's bigger than yours contest, but more of a, I don't have a good picture of what other people's infrastructure looks like other than where they've done talks. So I'm very interested to compare notes later on, how many servers, how many users, number of metadata, all that kind of thing. Very interesting to get an idea of kind of the scale of all that. Anyway, let me see. So what I'm going to talk about today is what Sanger's been doing with IRODs in 2020. But really, it's about the complexities of having a large installation, how we manage it, the kind of issues we run into, the kind of things that have bitten us, basically, from having this kind of thing, as well as the kind of solutions we found to it. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a fair amount of capacity in IRODs at Sanger. This graph here is part of our internal monitoring. It's visible to our users as well, and it helps manage the capacity of the systems, both from their point of view and from ours. We actually have Slack updates 3 times a week of kind of output from this kind of thing, giving us an idea of what the capacity is like. As you might be able to see, hopefully, I'm not sure how well this comes out on your screens. While we've got a lot of resources, most of them are actually full. They're all file system based. We don't have any other object stores at the moment. It's all Linux systems with file systems. And from the resources are from 3 to 6 to a server. And many of them are on hardware that we need to retire as it's out of warranty or approaching end of life or things like that. So before I go on, I wanted to find some terms that I'm going to use in the talk in case people haven't heard of them. So has everyone heard of technical debt? One definition attributed to the creator of the term, Ward Cunningham, is that the concept is a concept in software development that reflects the implied cost of additional rework caused by choosing an easy, limited solution now, instead of using a better approach that would take longer. Now, I don't really like that definition. Another one might be that the work that is needed to maintain a system over time when design decisions or use patterns change. And it's worth noting that some technical debt is pretty much essential, otherwise the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. Oh, yak shaving. The definition for this, according to Wiktionary, is any apparently useless activity which, by allowing you to overcome intermediate difficulties, allows you to solve a larger problem. It could be said that a large chunk of my working life involves yak shaving. And do you see how technical debt and yaks might be related? Herons, long-legged, long-necked, freshwater and coastal birds. Probably unrelated to yaks, but we'll see. On a side note, the picture here is actually some street art that appears all around Cambridge in the UK. It's done by the nickname Cambridge Banksy. And you can find lots of these stencil herons all over the city. This one was just a few hundred meters from my house, for example. Now, this is a Zoom talk, and you've been attending a lot of Zoom talks over the next few days. And I thought I'd try something different this time. So each of these icons are going to appear throughout the talk. Now I wonder, can you tell me how many yaks we needed to shave, how many herons we had to deal with, and how much technical debt we needed to collect? So, I missed a slide, I haven't. Oh, okay, so what we needed to do is do operating system upgrades on over 100 live servers. So we had a mix of Red Hat and Ubuntu 12, and we needed to go to Ubuntu 18. So you starting counting? That's 3. So by the time I've got to the end of this slide, it'll be 3 shaved yaks and 2 items of technical debt. So for us, 2020 was really the year the technical debt collector came calling. Most of our systems were on end-of-life, unsupported operating systems. We started migrating to Red Hat, then they were bought by IBM, and they increased the price, so we had to move off. Renzi had kindly kept the 4.1x stream going, but had end-of-life the branch of 4.1.12, which led me to win a bet that we wouldn't make it to 1.13, so it was time to move to 4.2x. We'd also use CF Engine for our configuration management, but frankly, that was becoming onerous to continue to manage. So after a bake-off of the sorted systems, we decided on Ansible. Finally, I'd been building the systems manually using a combination of FAE, fully automatic installer, and later satellites to install the operating system, and then Ansible to manage it, as well as CF Engine. But configuring iWorld mostly by hand, automating a bit more each time we deployed a new system. This clearly wasn't sustainable or easy to hand over to my colleagues, especially as we had to redo the over 100 machines. And so my colleagues and I, mostly my colleague Matthew Vernon and Brett Hartley, started to do the work to fully automate the install. We had a hard target as well, a security audit that was happening later that year that all of this work needed to have done by. So we had 8 months to plan and implement all of these migrations. We knew going in that this would be a tricky endeavor. We had to upgrade operating systems often located on the same disks as the data. Also, we couldn't do a big bang upgrade. We had to do a zone at a time, which meant handling version differences on clients and between servers. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we had federation, which means that you can have different server versions that federate with each other. But the clients that talk to the server need to be the same version. But we don't have federation on all the zones. There's one particular zone that isn't federated. Our informatics teams needed to test and fix any tools that had issues. And at the start of the project, there was only 2 of us working on ours. So how do we approach this? Well, when it came to the Ubuntu systems, which is the majority of the systems, we did in-place upgrades. We marked the resources down, and that meant that we could do this without any downtime for the end user. This is a massive win. We had, as I mentioned, a good tens and tens of servers to do this work on. And the users, by and large, did not notice it, even when they were continuing to ingest data into the system on an ongoing basis. So that the in-place upgrade, if you haven't run into this with Ubuntu, is basically where you upgrade the operating system while it's still running, and you have to reboot and that kind of thing. So it's not frictionless or no downtime, but you can move between different versions. And I think you can do this on Red Hat as well, but we didn't try that one. Red Hat itself, we installed over the top via manual OS upgrade. So yeah, that means basically installing the operating system over the top of the old Ubuntu operating system and hoping it all worked out. So far, I've mostly been talking about the consumers, which is where all the data was. The providers were a lot easier. Just a reminder, people have used a lot of different terms over the last day or so. The provider is the term for the iWorld router. It also used to be called the iCat, or the catalog server. And the consumer is what used to be called the resource server, or the iRes, and it's usually where the resources are held or managed from. So the providers themselves, we made new ones, basically. We built a new server, usually in VMware, but sometimes on physical hardware. And we switched the domain name, or rather the DNS pointer over when we were ready to do the upgrade. We had to remember to set the DNS TTL time from 10 minutes down to 1 beforehand. It's not perfect, there's so many things to do caching, but enough for our purposes. We were going to switch them as we did the upgrade. So there was downtime anyway, and it was wasn't any issue that we ran into. We could also build these systems in advance of the upgrade, install iWorld's 4.12 on them, and then do the upgrade on the new systems, which usually had more hardware or more resources available to them. And yeah, possibly significant data loss if we did the work. Yeah, no worries at all, no sleepless nights. Well, seriously, as the zones were replicated, we had another copy of the data. We never worked on both copies at a time. I trusted my colleagues. And indeed, we didn't lose a single bit during this work. It's a tribute to the skill of my colleagues, Matthew and James, who spent literally weeks reinstalling consumer after consumer. And yet we had to add 2 more people to the project to give us enough bandwidth. Now, we had to work around a few issues with the upgrades. And I'm not talking about iWorld's bugs here. These are all operating system bugs and in some cases technical debt. When we first tried to do an in-place upgrade via disk upgrade, we hosed the boot setup, and so we needed to do an upgrade boot check afterwards. And this is actually the Debian bug linked to there. It took us about a working day to do full system in terms of reboots and that kind of thing, but we could do more than once, and we brought more team members in to parallelize, as I mentioned last slide. So yeah, the Debian bug mentioned there, that's the grub configuration files didn't quite get updated correctly. And so upgrade grub didn't do the right thing, gave an error message, and then the system was effectively unbootable. So you need to fix things and then run it again. And the UDEV, so UDEV is what we had UDEV rules to name our interfaces, and that was fine. You know, we'd have an interface instead of ZXB32Rev11 or something. We had them called site or something similar to point to particular VLANs and things that they were plugged into. But as you went between different Ubuntu versions, how those rules worked changed. And so the rules that defined the names and hence all the configuration that went with those names changed. And so we needed to update the UDEV rules at the time we did the upgrades. Triple SD, love it and hate it. You've got to hate it. It's software that we use for name caching, and it broke on the upgrade a little bit, so we needed to rebuild its cache. And this is something we need to do every now and again anyway with the SSD, we find, particularly on heavily used systems. This prevents UID and GUID lookup for a bit, so we couldn't just kind of press on. We needed to do that work first, let it finish, and then move on from that. And finally, the 1804 upgrade for us may have failed because of the shortage of space in/boot. When we built the systems initially, there was only a certain amount of space allocated to the boot partition. And we've been running these systems in some cases for a number of years, and with new kernels come along, and then you've been filling up boot space. So we needed to kind of check and remove kernels before doing the upgrade. 427. So at the same time as doing the OS upgrades, we're also planning for an upgrading from 4112 to 427, and we're still on 427 today. Because we had 5 zones to do, we intended to start with the Federation Master and then move through the rest. But life has a way of derailing the best laid plans. What's the joke? If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Well, in the end, we did a moderately sized zone first, as it wasn't federated. And the Federation Master was actually the penultimate one. This allowed us to keep the changes to the I command to the last minute, apart from the one zone's users. There was a scary bit in doing the 47 upgrade, other than switching things over to begin with. There's basically 2 parts to the database work that's needed in upgrade to 427 from 412 anyway. The first is to deprecate values no longer in use, and that can be run any time after the upgrade. And actually, we got our friendly neighborhood DBAs to cook up a version of the SQL that did the change in 1 atomic commit, rather than let it run over days incrementally changing the values, and it went really quickly. That wasn't gating the upgrade, that was just stale information. So we could run that afterwards, and we did, but before we allowed users to use the system again. The real blocker was the query that needed to convert the resource tree locations from strings in the database, as they were coded in 4 and 12, to just the ID of the parent resource, which, to do so, is a database lookup and an update on every single object, all several hundred million objects. So I'd like you to guess how long this took, and I'll give you some hints. So on the CGP zone, which is the moderately sized one that we upgraded first of all, it took around 5 hours to run the update, which had about 14 million million objects, excuse me, in the CGP zone itself. So how long do you think the largest zone took? This is the 6 zone, and it has 250 million objects. So some quick guesses in the chat. I'll just pause a minute and flick over to my Slack window. Okay, we've got some guesses coming in. All good guesses. I want to give it just another minute. It took a week. That was a week of downtime for this zone. We had only scheduled 2 days of downtime for this work, so a bit awkward, but we got there in the end, and we didn't lose any information. So we did have one unintended outage as part of this work, though. At this point, not all our configuration was under management because, as before mentioned, a lot of the installations were still being done relatively manually, certainly for the application. And so in one particular case, we omitted the rules inclusion on one zone accidentally. This took actually a lot of time and attention to debug, to work out why behavior of the zone wasn't working the way we expected it to. And it turned out that in the server config, we just missed out the section that included the rule files. The rule files were actually on the disk. We just hadn't told OS to use them. These days, we've automated the install and the configuration of our roles using the JSON input to the setup script. So now errors at least will be more consistent across all the infrastructure. And so while we were testing, or in fact, while we were doing some of the upgrades, we ran into a few bugs and reported them as we go along, if you like to. And I thought it might be instructive to go through the issues we ran into, explain why they caused these issues, what we did about them. And this isn't meant to be, and another thing, shakes fist at flower, etc. So some of the rules being deprecated, in other words, being deprecated in favor of others. And you should check the upgrade docs if you're moving from 4.1 to 4.2 to see which ones are being deprecated and see which ones you can move over. Now, to be clear, we didn't need to change this for the upgrade, but it's a good time to future-proof it. So take that technical debt. It's one less piece for future me to worry about. We use Oracle backend, and our current Oracle database uses VAC cluster and TNS to manage the name mapping between the database and server locations. TNS isn't supported in 4.2.7, so we had to manually hard-code the names. It works, but it's required us to script this as part of the upgrade, and any future name changes on the VAC cluster end will require manual intervention and probably downtime. Set up iWads. The script that is attempts to create a new zone when it starts up. It kind of assumes that it's working on a completely de novo zone. And it fails because it tries to name it the same thing that's already in the database, thus violating a unique constraint in the SQL. This is an issue if you run This is an issue if you run more than one provider per zone, as we do on several of our zones, or if you're installing a new provider to replace an old one, which is what we have to do pretty much all of our zones. Also, as part of the Oracle conversion, the automated conversion from the 4.12 config to 4.2.7 version didn't handle Oracle really at all well. We ended up needing to set this manually as via the script for every provider when we did the upgrade. Brett wrote a fairly long bash script with a whole load of awk and things like that to kind of monitor things into the right setup. Update JSON is a script that we relied quite a lot on in 4.1.12. And if you've not used it, it's a little script that updated a JSON config file against the old schema and told you if you made one of the many mistakes one can make if you're hand editing JSON. Unfortunately, this didn't get ported to 4.2x. We now generate a config file for Ansible templates, as I mentioned, but we didn't have that in place for the upgrade, so we ran the risk of making typos. The joys of packaging. So the package name has changed between the 4.1x and 4.2 versions, certainly in Ubuntu. This means that removing the resource package triggers the package cleanup, which tries to remove the resources on the host. The workaround for this is to ensure that iWads is stopped, and then the package installation does the right thing. But the first time we found that, that was a scary moment. Or just going back a second, it's worth mentioning that there are checks built into iWads for an rmresc command that it doesn't actually remove the resource if there are objects still in there. So even if it tried to do that, it still would have not managed. Okay, so systemd. Now I know there's some systemd fans in the audience, and also there's some people who perhaps don't have a strong opinion of systemd. But 4.2.7 doesn't come with a systemd configuration file, which means it uses systemd's. Let's make a best guess based on the init.d file. So, sorry for all the text. We suffered, hopefully you don't have to. That being said, I don't think even 4.2.9 supports systemd yet. I could be wrong. And even though we still have some of the challenges mentioned, it's basically a combination for us of bugs and design decisions we've made over the years. A lot has to do with, in our case, with service ordering and dependencies. the way systemd assumes file systems comes up, for example, we want to make sure that iOS comes up after that. Same with SSD, we need to make sure that SSD is up before iOS comes up, or iOS can't look up any of its user IDs or anything like that. Also, it will have a default user that it will run as, and we have lots of users for historical reasons over the time. And so we had to make sure the systemd files took, took account of that. Likewise, with Oracle, we found a number of issues and bugs around setting environment variables to make sure that the Oracle environment could be found when I would start it up. And the thing we found as well is the default emulation for systemd didn't quite understand how to restart the iOS services due to the way that the forking is done, the startup and that kind of thing. And so we needed to kind of show particular systemd-isms to make sure that it started and stopped correctly. And as we already had systemd systems of 1.2.18 for 4.1.12, then we needed a different configuration for 4.2. And of course, we needed to kind of change the configuration management at the time of the upgrade for those systems. For 4.2.7 iCommands, the upshot of the 4.2.7 iCommands not working on anything other than 4.2.7 and later is that we had to upgrade every server before we upgraded the clients. Now, I know eventually doesn't guarantee compatibility between versions, but it makes it tricky when we can't upgrade all the systems at the same time. Particularly, we can plausibly upgrade all with one zone at one time, but multi-zones within gets trickier, particularly when you've got one set of clients that need to talk to things. The word on the street, though, is that you might be able to build iCommands into an arbitrary path, which could alleviate this for us. We could use modules, for example, to provide different paths for people. And check out Marcus's talk about this on Thursday, at the same time as this talk, as it happens. Now, I will admit this is niche, but this query I mentioned here was added in something like 3.3.1 or earlier. So you need to have an install that was originally done, in other words, a database that was set up by another version of iOS earlier than 3.3.1. So anyone with an install that old? Show of hands in the Slack chat. I think ours is 2 point something. I don't know if Pete's lurking in the background and he can say exactly the first version that we actually deployed. But it's fairly niche for this kind of thing. So Ubuntu packaging, it can be quite smart, and probably Red Hat packaging as well. I'm slightly less familiar with RPM. And it can know that some of the files it deploys are templates or sample configs, and so prompt to keep changes. Unfortunately, the old packages don't do this as a 4.2.7. So when the package rolls out, we need to have our configuration manager basically stomp over the top of it and put the new file in. And IMeta, the IMeta command is with its QU argument, is for querying metadata, and the runner Z is for accessing a remote zone that your account has federated access with. The bug for this means that the IMeta command tells you it's going to query the remote zone, but actually looks at the local zone, which basically gives you no results in our federated case. We're actually running with a patched version of the 4.2.8 iCommand backported to 4.2.7. And it's only a problem, of course, if you have federated zones. Alas, we have 4. So Baton is the tool that our pipelines use a lot. It takes JSON input and can do all kinds of things like uploading files into iRods, doing metadata, all these kinds of things. And the statement here is actually a massive understatement. Almost deserves its own talk. It took weeks to get this working and multiple developers. So I bet you're wondering when I get around to this. What's up with the Heron? Well, when we were upgrading the zone and operating systems, this COVID thing happened. You might have heard of it. And the Sanger has, I think, the second largest group of DNA sequencers on the planet. We joined the effort to investigate. Until this actually went public, yeah, they had a code name, Project Heron. And it turns out a lot of the sequence run information went into iRods. And we found this out just as we planned to upgrade the entire infrastructure. This meant the system we thought was out of scope for the code research was actually part of the QA pipeline. Remember that week-long database migration? Can you guess when it happened? Anyway, big zone upgrade happened, and I want to say a big thanks to my colleague Brett here for being the person who actually did it. We didn't lose any data when we were on the latest version of iOS and Ubuntu. At least it was the latest when we started the planning. 4.2.8 and Ubuntu 20.04 came out during the rollout. We haven't upgraded to 4.2.8 yet. We're still waiting for 4.2.9, which came out yesterday. So we will start looking at that fairly soon. We wanted, so at that point, we'd done all that kind of thing, but there's still some security areas outstanding that we wanted to deal with. We wanted to turn on SSL encryption and move away from KRBOS, which had dependencies on our Active Directory infrastructure, crypto versions, and towards PAM, which used LDAP. This meant that users needed to learn INIT instead of KINIT, but otherwise worked well for the kind of normal user, the kind of interactive user who logs in, does some things, downloads a bit of data, logs out again, kind of stuff. And what we were hoping is that we could use the init command to extend PAM tokens, and therefore we could use that for everything. But it turns out you can't actually extend PAM tokens beyond the default 2 weeks. And so for our pipeline accounts, we're still using native authentication. And we thought we'd be dead clever. We thought we'd get iWads to tell us when a user tried to use KRBOS auth, as now we switched everybody to PAM auth. And lots of documentation out of our control still mentioned doing KINIT rather than INIT. So we got regular support tickets in kind of saying, help, this doesn't work anymore. Particularly for users who haven't touched iWads in weeks or months and hadn't got the multiple emails that we sent out telling people what the change was. So we tried to use the PEP API auth response accept to log or maybe email, but unfortunately we couldn't get that to work. We couldn't get the rule to work the way we wanted it to. So we had to rely on them complaining, which isn't ideal, but we think we're most of the users through now. We did a few other things as well. I'm conscious of time moving on a bit. As the year wound on, we couldn't rest on our laurels. Consistent feedback from our user community is that command line tools can be hard to use from the perspective of a scientist that just wants their data. So we looked at iWads Web GUI, NFS WADs, and getting all the metadata into the Elasticsearch document store using the indexing plugin. And actually, I did a talk on migrating data at a previous UGM. My colleague Matthew has spent a lot of time automating the approach. We've now since migrated around 6 petabytes, mostly automatically and mostly without affecting any user. I think we had one issue from doing this over something like a year's worth of migration. It's been utterly crucial to being able to decommission resources. And that link there is actually a link to our GitHub for this tool that other people can use. It makes use of Wi-Fi move and back off and things like that to be able to move files between resources. And so indexing plugin, with hundreds of millions of metadata items, it was always going to take a while, but we still ran into a few issues of scale, meaning that we're waiting for some fixes in 4.2.9 on the delay rule server before we can press ahead with fully ingesting all the metadata from our largest zone into Elasticsearch. The Metamax Web GUI is up and working for us. We look forward to the ability to link it to the Elasticsearch document store created from the indexing plugin that I mentioned earlier. Ran into a couple of issues, but I think mostly the ones that the community also found. So it was good to kind of be part of that. So I might actually do a lightning talk if there's interest on how we deploy this. Please let me know in Slack if people would find that helpful. We have NFS WADs up and working, but we ran into an issue where collections is very large, 65,000 files, for example, in one collection caused some issues, and we're kind of getting towards the bottom of that at the moment with Ventus help. Just so what now? We've 2020 is over. Long live 2021. Well, we're looking at deploying our own Yoda, and we'll looking at upgrading to 4.2.9. And in order to make the upgrade less work, we're putting in a lot of effort at the moment to construct a continuous integration system that can deploy iWads systems for test and run our unit tests against them. And the idea is to get our informatics colleagues to also submit tests. So if the CI is green, we've got moderate confidence we can upgrade. Our experience is, in general, is that the point upgrades have been fairly smooth, but major upgrades are a lot of work. We're hoping that's not the case for 4.3, and we're hoping to have the infrastructure in place to be able to do those testing fairly easily for people. We really like compatibility between versions. I understand how tricky this is with protocol and things like that, but it was something that would make us and our users' life a lot easier. Particularly as when our users deploy their own systems on our OpenStack private cloud, then they just don't always follow our instructions to install iRods, or sometimes go off to the internet, look at the instructions, and download iRods and set up themselves, which means they quite often run with a version of iRods that is different from the one that we have in production. Hasn't bitten us yet, but it's something that we're all aware of. So something I didn't talk much around is the automation of the installs. This took installs of new systems from weeks from when we got them delivered to days. And this has been a big win for us. So I'd like to say thanks to all my colleagues, especially Brett and Matthew and James in ISG, but also Keith James, David Jackson, Matthew Astley, and Andrew Menzies from the DNA pipelines and cancer and somatic mutations informatics teams, respectively. So how many did you count? So the answer is, including this slide, 40 Yaks, 8 Herons, and 23 items of technical debt. Thank you mostly to Unsplash for providing the photos for this. And that's it. Questions? And I really must update my profile pic.
Yeah, I was going to say, who's in that picture? It's very good.
The previous company a long time ago.
Excellent. Yes, I know that a lot of those issues that you link to, you know, I'm pretty sure most of them have been fixed along the way. Do you have any idea of how many of the ones that you link to are still open? Just off the top of your head?
I'm not sure. Apart from the System D one, I think most of them are actually closed.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. We have a couple questions. Mostly, we've got the Constable bot is back, so we fixed that. So now that's in full effect. Are you considering a switch to Ceph or something like that? Object store is in your future, as opposed to thousands of spinning disks.
So we've certainly looked at it. We did a test with the 4.1 back in the day when it was first released, I think, and it pretty much worked as described. The kind of reasons we haven't migrated are kind of, I don't know a number of them really. One of which is, you know, the plugin actually hasn't been released yet. So without that being released, you know, going to something for all our data is a little leery of, but we're aware that sometimes you need to, someone needs to use it for it to be adopted and that kind of thing. Also, we had some issues around checksums and how you would generate checksums and things like that. So, for example, quite often at the moment, we have cron jobs that run iScan and iFacet across every resource to verify that what is on the disk is what the catalog thinks it's got. And this has found assorted issues over the time, been very helpful. But of course, we can't do that with Ceph or, as I understand it, with S3 for that matter. We would. We're kind of thinking about how to handle that. Well, our current thinking is probably more that we let Ceph deal with this because it already does its own checksums behind the scenes. That was another uncertainty around that. And then finally, there was kind of the budgetary area of, at the moment, we have 2 copies, which means buying 2 servers effectively for the data we put in. So would we want to have 2 sets of Ceph servers? How would we want to handle that kind of thing? And if we did that, that would be 2 times 1.8 copies of the data. And budgetary speaking, that's been too rich for our purse holders to swallow. I think the Ceph has a lot to recommend it. It's something I was quite keen on. I mean, it's something we're at the moment looking at again, because certainly Ceph has been very resilient in a number of failure scenarios we've had. The other thing as well is that we've been very, as Pete mentioned in his introduction, we've been very careful to try and keep it as, keep it simple as much as we can. Minimal number of rules, minimum number of ideas, minimum number of integrations, with the idea that we've always got a way out. We've always got a way to get the data. We've always got a way to get the metadata, that kind of thing. And that's always my worry with an object store on top of an object store, basically.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We do have a question from Alan. He says, are there any other 4.2 plus only features or plugins or clients that have interested you besides, you know, the things that you've mentioned, indexing, things like that? You know, in the day-to-day, we only hear about the things that are broken.
Yeah. So let's see. We're quite interested in the indexing plugin.
Yeah.
That's something that we'd like to look at again. And because we have our own kind of stuff that we've kind of hand rolled for bits of that, but I'd much rather not manage to own support something ourselves. And also the indexing plugin can do a lot more than what we've got. So that's something that's interesting in. I know there's something else, but it's escaping my brain at the moment.
Pete chimed in with auditing and perhaps Gen 3 integration as well, along with what Mike was talking about yesterday.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think is going to be a big thing for us this year in terms of getting a proof of concept out to people. It's something that a number of other people are quite excited by, with the original idea of having our scientists and researchers have a place to put files with their metadata and have that in a controlled way so that they don't leave the institute or go into a research project and then where is the file kind of a thing. One of the first things that we bought I was in for originally.
Right. We do have a question here. It says, checksumming is less of an issue on self-healing file systems like ZFS or Ceph. You can only check on ingest and egress, and then you trust the fabric, like you said, to do its own job. I know that we also have an open issue. We haven't done the work yet. Maybe it'll happen for 4.3, is to move the checksum operation down into the storage plugin level. And that way, every storage plugin can implement its own version of how much it cares and what it does. And for S3 or for whatever, it would basically just ask the system, "Hey, what do you have?" And that's what iRods would trust.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we never, I think, got around to corrupting an item in Ceph and trying to download it in iRods and see what happened.
Right.
To do, I think. But as James mentions in the chat, we've had a number of years of experience of Ceph now, and more so than when we first had a look at it. And I think we're more willing to trust it than we were at the time.
That's right. And I think the tooling around it has also gotten significantly better.
Well, I know something else that we're kind of interested in, I guess, is the whole containerization kind of stuff. We've got some Kubernetes systems in-house, and people are looking at that. So how we integrate with that, how we deploy things, whether it's containerization, Kubernetes, what have you, all things around that are quite interesting. I think we're quite late to the party on, but one step at a time.
Very good. And Mr. Mike Conway's doing another shout out for the Sci versus Go client, talking about the Gen 3 work as well. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to be done right around the corner after we all take naps. It's going to be great. But we can't nap until after the pub quiz. So thank you, John. It's always a pleasure. I now understand what the Heron was for. I was very confused.
You're good.
Thank you. And we will head over to the pub quiz Zoom link. See you all in a little bit. Thanks.